Good morning. All right, we're going to be in 1 Timothy chapter 3 this morning. 1 Timothy chapter 3. So when we studied chapter 1 about a month ago, one of the discussions we had in there is that, to me, we start to see in the book this idea of what I'll call competing portraits. So for example, in verse 3 of chapter 1, there are these descriptors that are used about false teachers. And then Paul immediately follows that up with, but our charge is, and that's when he then talks about our charge is love that issues forth from a pure heart and a clean conscience and those things. And then in chapter 4 or 5, for example, there's even more discussion about what those false teachers look like. And then sprinkled throughout the book, we get more and more information about, you could say, false teachers and true teachers if you're thinking about Timothy. But really, for example, in chapter 2, it really expanded it past what I would call teachers and really talked about what it looks to be like a true Christian, right? We see that men are told that they need to raise holy hands in prayer, avoiding quarreling and violence. Women are told how they need to adorn themselves with good works to avoid apparel that distracts from the gospel instead of attracts to the gospel. We learn a little bit more about the relationship between the men and the women in the church there. Well, I think 1 Timothy 3 really helps expand the idea of those portraits even further. That if you wanted to, close your eyes and try to figure out, well, how could I envision what a Christian looks like? Really, the qualifications for elders and deacons here give you a lot of detail about the sorts of things that you could look for. Now, if we're appointing elders and deacons, there's perhaps a more strict adherence to the sorts of things we're seeing here, these descriptions of blamelessness. But really, as we'll see when we get in a day or a week or two, when Paul instructs Timothy with these 5 things that he's to provide an example to the brethren in, really, almost everything that's presented in this section about elders and deacons are reflected in what he is supposed to provide an example to all the brethren in terms of behavior. There's some family things like marriage and those things that aren't mentioned related to Timothy. But broadly, we can see this, I would say, like increasing depth as to the behavior and the portrait that we should look for in the Christians around us as we think about these sections. So before we go any further, I want us to read chapter 3, and then we'll have some discussion. Chapter 3 of 1 Timothy. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. And let them also be tested first, then let them serve as deacons if they prove blameless. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. I hope to come to you soon, but I am writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up in glory. As you think about those descriptions of elders and deacons, I want you to reflect on the things that we have kind of noticed as the themes of the book. If you remember, the themes that we've called out so far have been how to conduct yourself in the household of God, blamelessness, the mystery of godliness, as well as, I forgot one of them, concern about false teachers. Whew, good thing I have my notes. Concern about false teachers. So as you think about those themes or sub-themes, however you want to describe them, what do you see reflected in these qualifications that they're looking for in elders and deacons? Jared?
One that popped out to me is just the mention of dignity several times. And having that be related to the reputation of the gospel, the concern for the nation's impression of the Church of God.
Yeah, I'll tell you, when I was studying this, the dignity aspects stuck out to me, partly because he must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. That idea of dignity, and then it references it again with the elders, with the deacons and then their wives. All of them require dignity. For me, what stuck out when I was studying it is the difficulty that can come when you're trying to keep your children submissive, yet not maintaining dignity while you're doing so, right? I have certainly been guilty of that. I think most fathers at some point have been. The question is that a trend, or is that a flash in the pan that you seek to overcome and improve as a father, right? The idea of being blameless here, I would not put forward as, well, he's never had an outburst of anger, he's never, yelled at his children or something like that. But would you say that he is dignified in how he does that work and how he interacts and leads his family? Great. What other themes do you see kind of showing up in these qualifications? Alan?
In verse 6, falling into the condemnation of the devil. That's, basically keeping away from false teaching in that aspect of it.
Yeah, so one of the big themes of the book starts out in verse 3 of chapter 1 is this false teacher problem. And from the very beginning of these qualifications, we start to see that he needs to be above reproach. But then down in verse 6, like Alan said, he mustn't be a recent convert because we don't want him to become puffed up or fall into condemnation. Similar to the dignity idea, he needs to be thought of well by outsiders. I connect those things. And then down in the deacon section, when it says that we need them to prove themselves blameless, again, this focus on, I would say, blamelessness, but also in relation to his knowledge and exposure to the gospel, right? What else do you see here? How does it relate to the themes in the book? Wayne?
Is there something between not being a novice and first tested that relates to the theme of the book that would be someone that is practiced, that before he what the way a Christian should look at his life as preparation for something.
Oh, yeah.
Bigger.
Yeah, it's preparation for something bigger. And what I would say, and one of the themes of the book that we talked about, is that there's a big emphasis on the reflection that God's people create, or the lens that God's people are for others to see our faith and to see God. And so when we see things like he needs to not be a new convert and needs to have a good repute among outsiders, I think that's highly reflective of this idea that we are the lens through which the world sees the gospel and the Father. And we need these leaders to take these roles on, be examples of what that looks like. Again, this isn't a requirement for them to be perfect, but these are things that would say, we want them to be examples of how people should see the gospel and the Father generally through their lives and their work. Great.
And you see that in 13 as well, that they gain a good standing for themselves. It's something you're gaining. It's not a title that you just automatically have. You gain that confidence in the congregation. You gain good standing.
Yeah, the gaining a good standing for themselves to me is a very difficult thing to think about, because some ways of thinking about that are, well, you get like a better heaven. I don't know how to make that square exactly, but we do know, for example, I think it's in James, where people who take on teaching are told that they bear a higher responsibility, a higher level of accountability. Well, I think about these two ideas as going hand in hand. That when we gain a good standing, that part of that, there's a downside to that in a way. That just like the teachers in James are told that, hey, you are essentially going to be held accountable to a higher level than others. Well, in the same way, I think there's some idea here of we will be considered in good standing as well as we help others attain to the blamelessness and the righteousness that the gospel is supposed to achieve. That there is the Lord blesses us in our doing. Again, that comes from James 1:26. That in that service we are blessed. And I think that service and the blessings that come from it are more likely what this means from a good standing than what some people might say, like you get a better slice of heaven, a bigger mansion or something. I don't know how that works.
That good standing will develop them into becoming leaders and elders.
Yeah, great. So, to me, there's one really... Oh, Belinda, go ahead.
I could be way off.
Great.
On the good standing, and I often am, but to me, I have a lot of experience with courts and judges and lawsuits and things like that. And
because of your work, let's just be clear.
Thank you. So, when someone is in good standing in the court, they have the right to be there. They have the right to present the petition. They have the right to present their lawsuit. And if they're not in good standing, the judge will dismiss it. So to me, this is like, because it's followed up with great boldness, it's like you have the right to be in this position.
Yeah.
You're verified, so to speak, in this position. And that alone will give you great boldness in front of the court. So.
And we would say, like, we have examples. For example, Moses, most of the time, every now and then he had an issue, was in good standing with the Lord, and that allowed him to access and intercede for the people. Just, the opposite side of the coin would be in 1 Peter when husbands are told that if they mistreat their wives, their prayers are going to be hindered, right? Like, you have both sides of this issue, right? If we don't serve properly, we're not in good standing, to the way Belinda talked about it, versus when we do serve well, we are all in good standing with the Father. Franco?
It's interesting that when he gives all those qualifications, certain option, he uses must quite often. And therefore, it comes a package. Like you cannot miss one without the other. They all complement each other.
So what Franco said is he sees must throughout here, that idea of requirement. I take a bit of a different point of view in that I think the overall requirement that we see for both the elders and the deacons is blamelessness or being above reproach. And that these are descriptors about how you would perceive or understand that blamelessness. And I generally take the point of view that they're not all required in perfect order, that may be a bar that's too high. The question is, would you view them as blameless? And so an example of that, in the discussions of how a man leads his household and his family, would you say that he is blameless as a father? And with that, when those children grow up, if they are or are not faithful, would you hold him blameless in thinking about his children's faithfulness and submission? Did he father them well? Did he teach them about the Lord? Did he hold them in submission when they were in his house? Well, would you say he's blameless in that regard? I mean, there are certainly men whose children grow up to be faithful Christians, but the father is not blameless in that activity. He didn't really have anything to do with it. And so I think that's where we need to be careful sometimes in how we think about these, is this idea of, sticking with this example, a man who has faithful or submissive children, Titus talks about the faithful aspect more, that we can have a man with faithful children, but he's not blameless in that regard. And usually the litmus test we put on that is, well, are they still Christians? Are they old enough? They're not. Okay, well then he is not blameless. He is deserving of blame. If they are faithful, he's blameless. But the problem is, we know fathers who are not Christians whose children become faithful. Well, that wouldn't automatically make them kind of meeting these requirements because their children are now faithful. So I think there's some push and pull on how we think about those a little bit. Wayne, what were you going to say?
And I think about blameless with children, how we are warned not to be so strict that they would not have their own, they would not have their own faith at some point. And being a father is nuanced, much like being an elder. So you can lord over children, you can lord over a congregation. So blamelessness is a limiting factor too.
Yes.
Within that activity.
That's great. I love that point, that the blamelessness is kind of, it plays both sides there. You can be overly critical, overly overbearing, and I think that's part of the dignified comment here as well. And then we have other passages, for example, that tell us, fathers, don't exasperate your children. I think that's part of the idea. When I read this, one issue stands out to me, and that is, I don't see any description of the work of these men. The closest thing that I see is when elders here are told that we need to understand verse 5, for someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for the church of God or God's church? To me, that's the closest thing to describing the work of these men in the book. So what does that mean or imply? What'd you say, Wayne?
Decision and latitude, the freedom to make choices. It's like a law in the Bible. It's not just a rule book of this, do this, don't do that. We're given some ability to decide, and the elders have to be given that latitude too. A lot of people are unforgiving when it comes to, they decided that this person needed to be rebuked or whatever.
All right, so Wayne's saying this is a symbol or sign that there's latitude. Jared, what were you going to say?
Yeah, maybe a couple things that could be the case. Number one, they already had an understanding of what these roles should be doing. Him writing to Timothy here, he's already in the work, and Paul is kind of just telling him about, some of the finer details, I suppose. So maybe they already had an understanding of what the work looked like. But then also number two, I think probably more likely, he's giving instructions about what they do is not the point here. I think he's more concerned in this letter about like we've talked about, like the perception of the church. And so he's less concerned about what they do in this instance and more concerned about the impact that they're having on the reputation of the gospel and their impact on, being an influence to false teaching and things like that.
I think both of those points are really great. Joshua, what were you going to say? Were you going to add?
I was going to say that Jesus often rebuked the Pharisees and the scribes because they didn't care for the people. He said, these people are like sheep without a shepherd. And an elder is supposed to be a shepherd. So the shepherd is supposed to guide the flock in the ways of Jesus and guide them in the scriptures.
All right. So I agree with that. That's great. This comparison of if you think about what Jesus wanted them to be, it would be the anti-Pharisees in many ways, which is actually an issue in this book, right? We've got false teachers who are trying to bind things that shouldn't have been bound, which pretty Pharisee thing to do, right? I think Jared hit the nail on the head, or both nails on their heads, when he described why there's not a lot of discussion of what these men are to do in this book. Because first, the book is especially about the prevention of false teachers. So I think that because of that focus on the prevention of false teachers and the general theme of the book, it's reasonable to conclude, one, that part of the elders and deacons' work is to help prevent impact or to prevent false teaching, which if you looked at Titus, that is very clearly highlighted as the work of elders, especially in related to this Judaizing teacher issue that they're dealing with here. But also, it is a focus on the relationships between brethren and the impact that lens or that view has on the gospel. And so these qualifications are highly focused on things that would impact the relationships among the brethren, right? He's told he needs to be self-controlled, respectable, able to teach, not violent, be gentle, not quarrelsome. So many of those things are about the relationships between the family, among the family. And that's a lot of what the book is dealing with. And I think to the first point that Jared made, I do think they have already had a good bit of instruction about what elders, especially what their work is. So if you think about the timeline, Timothy is in Ephesus, as far as I know, when he receives this. Well, this is about 4 years after, it's between 2 and 4 years when you look at the variety of dates, after Paul meets the Ephesian elders in Miletus. And when he gives them that instruction about how they're supposed to look for false teachers, that's where we get the look out for wolves among you, that passage in Acts. Well, this is 2 to 4 years after that happened. And so they've already had pretty strong instruction about what elders are to do. And outside of Acts 6, there's not a lot of discussion about what deacons are to do generally. So that one's even, I would say, a little murkier. Yeah, Alan.
Could it be that, this is just that there are some men that are in the positions that shouldn't be, and they're trying to, he's telling us how we should be behaving in the church and everything over and over again, so they're not behaving right.
Well, that question of maybe there's some that aren't behaving right would be supported based on chapter 5, where Paul lays out for Timothy that part of his role as an evangelist is to hear charges against elders and rebuke them if necessary, and also to not be hasty in appointing them. Like that would be a decent support in the idea that either Paul is concerned about that potentially happening or that it's already happening. I think that's a great point. A couple other things that I noticed when I studied this is that, to me, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, just real quick.
Yeah.
I think the first passage, what you just said, going on what you were saying, in regard to how the gospel is viewed and who that is verse 7, that he must be well followed by those outside the faith. So again, looking at reputation, and we use this word practice, which you preach, is how are you viewed by those outside the church? Are you displaying these qualities not only how you serve the body, but also those outside the faith? Are they seeing these in you and how you live your life, how you model yourself? Are you being, are you being that image of Christ in everyday life, not just
Not just here.
Not just here in this building, or is that what you're displaying? Is that example of the life that you're living, to where they can see that in you. And that is what is being a positive reflection of the gospel.
Yeah, I think that discussion of the positive reflection of the gospel also really highlights the potential issue for hypocrisy, or for not living a single life, but in leading a double life. That I have my life when I'm with my brethren, when I'm doing Jesus-y things, and then I have my life over here when I'm at work, when I'm in the marketplace, when I'm doing the things that I do when I'm not doing that. This is my 5-hour-a-week life, and this is my, how many hours are there in the week? Like 149 or something, 140 something. The other 140 hours or whatever it is, I'm living this life. And that would be the opposite of blameless, right? That would be, hey, I know there is a right way to live, and I reflect that when I want to. And then over here, when I'm in other settings that maybe that is less convenient for me, I don't reflect those ideals. That would be the opposite of blamelessness in this regard.
And I think the same is true of deacons.
Yeah.
Say that, because it says let them be tested first. They're tested to see, is this something that they just put on as a show for a particular moment of time, or is it something that they live? Is it something that they have these characteristics all the time that develop, and these qualities are there as they serve for the benefit of the gospel?
Yeah, once they've been tested and proven blameless, let them serve. Yeah. Megan.
I think this also puts pressure on the congregation, because that means we have to know who we're appointing outside of the congregation. You can't just say, oh yeah, we see them all the time at church and they're constantly leading and they're constantly having us to their house, or whatever you want to say. But you have to know them on a more personal outside of the congregation.
Yeah, this knowledge of them requires a deeper relationship than I see you for 2.5 to 3.5 hours a week, and I don't know anything about the rest of your life. Yeah. I see lots of things that are similar between these qualifications. I actually, in my opinion, see very little that's not similar. There's a lot more detail given in the qualifications of elders, but if you think about categories, most of those are reflected in similar ways in the idea of deacons. And like I said, that goes on in a little bit when Paul tells Timothy the ways he's supposed to be an example. Basically, all of those things that are talked about here are reflected in that with Timothy. And then you would say, hey, with women just a little bit ago, they were told that they needed to be blameless in many ways. And then when he talks about supporting widows towards the end of the chapter, the exact same thing is going to happen, and those qualifications are actually quite similar. And so I just note that we often think about those as very distinct qualifications. I think they may be more overlapping than we sometimes maybe realize, because we look at the elders list is really long, the deacons list is shorter. There are a few concepts that are distinct for sure. So for example, Alan brought this out, not a recent convert and well regarded by outsiders. That idea is not really mentioned at all in terms of deacons, but it very clearly is mentioned in terms of elders. Interestingly, with the deacons, they are told not to be double-tongued and to hold the mystery of the faith, and those ideas aren't really present in the qualifications for the elders. Now, I think when you think about, which one of these qualifications are in which group, well, we wouldn't say that we want deacons that are not well regarded by outsiders, right? And so maybe this is an idea of degrees. Is this man very well regarded by outsiders, and then the deacon is kind of in a neutral position, and he's not, can't be negative in this light, right? Similarly, the deacons are told they can't be double-tongued. I wouldn't submit that means the elders can be double-tongued, because that qualification is not there. So a lot of these are really commentaries about what is the portrait of a faithful Christian, and some of this is about the blamelessness of the measure to which they have that, right? But deacons are told they need to hold the mystery of the faith, which to me is interesting. I note that one because we often talk about elders' work as spiritual and deacons' work as physical. But holding the mystery of the faith is a distinctly spiritual requirement. And we're going to talk more about that as we go to the end of the chapter. But it's a distinctly spiritual requirement. And so I think that maybe we should sometimes be careful in trying to separate elders and deacons' work based on what's physical and what's spiritual. They certainly have different roles. When we go look at what Paul told the elders at Miletus to do, it's very clear that they are to wage war against false teaching. That's clear in Titus as well. Whereas when we see deacons mentioned in Acts 6, they are doing a work that is mostly physical, but that does not mean it has no spiritual aspect to it, right? And then one other thing that stands out to me as a difference is in verse 11, their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. To me, this is a little interesting because there's no discussion related to the elders about their wives other than that they have them. There's no requirements listed of the wives, yet they are listed here related to the deacons. Again, I don't think that this would mean that, well, that means the wives of elders, they don't have to be dignified. It's totally fine if they slander people. Cool if they're not sober-minded, and they don't really have to be faithful, right? I don't think that would be the conclusion that any of us come to, but it is interesting that the women are called out, the wives are called out related to the deacons, but not related to the elders. Crystal?
The right section of this sandwiched by things about deacons, but in particular about the qualifications for deacons, it's all one passage. And so there, we refer to all.
Yes, so Crystal's point is, hey, this is all one section, so if it just says their wives, perhaps the there can reflect elders and it can reflect deacons. I think there's some, that point when I've talked about it to people, there's some question of like, yeah, but it's literally sandwiched between deacons in verse 8 and then in verse 12, let deacons, and then in the middle there's this comment about wives. That's kind of weird to say, well, then it's not about them. And it refers to all of them. There's also an even more complicated problem. The Greek doesn't say wives.
Was it implied?
It says women.
That is complicated.
Yeah. In lots of passages that we translate as wives, it just says women. The translators here decided that this refers to women, or refers to wives. It is the same idea as what we usually translate as women. So, that could mean a couple things. It means the translators did a perfect job, and this is certainly just about the deacons' wives. Or it's about the elders' wives and the deacons' wives. And kind of, as we've highlighted, it's weird to me if you apply this to the deacons' wives and then say, well, like, this doesn't matter for the elders' wives. Like, that would be a weird way to handle that.
And it would be weird that it would apply to women and not men.
Weird that it applies to women and not men. Well, so here's, but we see this in the book a number of times, right? In the last chapter, we talked about there are some requirements for men that are mentioned about how they lift holy hands and how they pray. And then there's this discussion about women and their apparel. So like there is in the book this push and pull between, hey, I've got some specific things I need to call out for the men. I've got some specific things I need to call out for the women. Here, their wives likewise must be dignified. If you say that's just women, that would imply that there is some special servant role for women. That makes us real uncomfortable.
What about the word there when it says is that a translation in the Greek, or is that just?
I'm not great at Greek. Everything I saw just said that what we translate as their wives is women, that there isn't a there. Like there is it's an implied adjective or whatever. There, is that an adjective? Yeah.
You know if that's the same word that's used in verse 12 when it says one wife? Wife, is that wife or is that women? Do you know?
I think it's woman. I think they're all women.
They're all women.
I don't know that there was a special word for
Yes.
wife.
Yeah, there's not really a word for wife as far as I know in Greek. It's just how closely related is that woman to the man. David, were you going to say something?
I think so.
Oh, he thinks so. Let's give him a minute.
Question.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying the literal translation of this is, let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Women likewise must be dignified. That's what you're asserting. Okay, and then you're concluding from that the implication is that there is a special servant role for women indicated here.
Potentially.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Are you asserting that that role is the same as the deacon role here, or is a separate role?
I think it's separate. If it exists, I think it's different.
Okay. That was my
Joshua?
I think the key here is what we were discussing back in the previous chapter. The word is likewise. And so it's building upon one another. They're building blocks of each other. And just as we talked about the women and their adornment, the women and the deacons and the wives of the elders and the deacons are to be adorning the gospel as well.
Yeah. No, I think
They're
that's great.
supposed to be building with their husband and adorning the gospel together.
Yeah. Now, if you were going to take this and say, well, maybe that does mean there's some special role for women that we haven't normally acknowledged, that would all come after the end of chapter 2, where women are told that they can't exercise authority and they can't teach over a man. So if you're going to take this to that point, you have to do so with the caveat of it's under the umbrella of it doesn't have authority in the same way that these other roles would have. Jacob, were you going to say something?
I was just wondering, like Belinda on verse 12, if wives, we throw that word out, then verse 12, what does that mean? Let deacons be the husband. If there's no such thing as wife, is there any such thing as husband? Or is it all just people?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's pressuring my understanding of Greek really, really far. I mean, clearly within Scripture, there's a lot of agreement about husbands and wives in basically every chapter. We read about husbands and wives throughout the book, throughout the Bible. So it's not like, oh, well, this means this concept doesn't make sense.
Because if it's like managing their household and managing their children, then you get into, well, is it two women? Is it, it's just like, where do you start where does it stop and start with yeah, that means a husband, wife, or no, that's just people. It's just kind of confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, but like I said, generally, translators agree what should be wives and husbands, right? I'm calling this out for two reasons. One, it's kind of weird the way that this section flows and that they're called out like this to me, and that it's not present in the elder section. Two, it makes explaining some of the teaching about widows in a little bit a lot easier to understand if there is some concept of a servant role that is with the congregation. And we can talk about that more when we get to that section about the widows. But it gets really weird to decipher some of the discussions of support versus not support in the section about widows if you make that about benevolence, for one thing. I've historically thought it was, but the more I've studied it, I'm not quite convinced. But that section makes a lot more sense if there is this other idea, too, of women are doing some role of service that I would say is compensated or supported by the congregation. And when I say there may be some role, I'm not saying that it's a deacon number 2 or something, to David's question, that there's just this idea potentially in this book of women holding a role related to dedicated service that might be compensated. And that could be what we're talking about in chapter 5 related to support. Melissa?
Well, just two thoughts. Jesus always elevated women. So that's one idea maybe here. But also, if we are to learn in chapter 2, I think that implies women are also to be a part of the work.
Yes.
And that maybe in some of the deacons' roles, it's more suitable for the wives or women in general to be doing instead of, men. Like providing food for widows, someone who's sick, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly throughout Jesus' ministry a very strong relationship with women, providing those supports for him, right? And does elevate them. What were you going to say, Michael?
Just real quick. So to that point, I guess back to what Crystal said earlier about how it's kind of sandwiched between deacons.
Yeah.
I think it can be a little challenging to make this mean women in general.
I agree.
When it's sandwiched between talking about, well, I guess we would say male deacons, and then verse 12 right after that goes right back to male deacons. So if you take this as right in the middle, Paul's also nodding towards women deacons. In verse 12, why is he not also saying, let deacons and deaconesses be the husbands and wives of one person? You know what I mean?
No, I think that's a great point. I think that this passage, it is most likely about wives, to be clear. And the people that I talked to, my dad, Barry, Brent Kirchhoff, a couple others, there's a split decision amongst the people that I talked to about what this verse means, which I was very surprised by when I talked to them. And I don't like Barry and Brent don't necessarily agree on some of that as well, which is I really wish we could get them to argue and have a conversation, because that'd be fun to watch. What are you gonna say, Chip?
I have to just study about whether there's a distinct Greek word for wife or woman versus man or husband.
You're way better at that than I am.
But just in a quick search here, it appears there may not be, because, for example, it says in Mark chapter 10, exact same word about men. And some Pharisees came up to Jesus testing him, and began questioning him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce his wife. Same word as husband here. And yet that word is used as husband in another word in the next verse. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, same two words in the same sentence. Same word used different ways in the same sentence. On men, I did a quick search on women. Similarly, it's the same thing. When you talk about a woman or a wife in Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus is in the Sermon on the Mount, he says now it's said that whoever sends his wife away to give her a certificate of divorce, the same word as woman. But 3 verses before that, he says, but when I say that everyone who looks on a woman and lusts for her has already committed adultery in his heart. Adultery is
really not your wife. Same Greek word.
So anyway, I think my point being is I think the context has to dictate.
Yes.
How it's used in English.
Yes, and what I would say is, again, if this role exists, it has to exist within the confines of the rest of the book, meaning it is a role that is within submission to the other men in the group. It doesn't have authority in the same way. But what I would say, kind of more important than all of that, is what the book is presenting is that we have requirements for everyone about how we live, meaning elders and deacons, you get some really clear descriptions about how you need to live, but Timothy's going to be given the same ones. Women here, regardless of exactly what that means, women are told ways that they need to live, dignified, and likewise are both used, reflecting the other requirements that have been given about the other Christians. Similarly, women are given multiple requirements in chapter 2, and they will again related to widows in chapter 5. What I think we need to take from this primarily is that we all have requirements to live as Christians and to live Christian lives in ways that are seeking blamelessness. And all of these things through the book are describing what that blamelessness looks like. It's not that our elders are held to one standard and the rest of us just get to slouch off and be awful Christians. It's not that women who aren't the wives of deacons get to be slouches and the women that are wives of deacons have to adhere to these things. We're all being called to righteousness and godliness and blamelessness, and we can understand the portrait of what that looks like as we go through these different descriptions. Thank you all so much. Next week we will get to the mystery of godliness, and then we'll go into chapter 4 also.